feels a bit strange in front of two people.
Yes.
To do the. Anyway. Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the FCCJ. I'm Andy Sharp. I work at Nikkei Asia. I think anyone who covers Japanese politics, certainly in Western media, will know our guest, Tobias Harris. I've known his work for many years, starting with his Observing Japan blog back in the day, and then his 8 years, I think, as a Japan analyst at Teneo, a short stint at the Center of American Progress, and now, to get this correct, the Deputy Director of the Asia Program of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. But perhaps Tobias is best known as the author of a biography of Shinzo Abe, the iconoclast, as Tobias named him. So without further ado, we've got lots to talk about today. Obviously, Abe's legacy is one big issue, issues surrounding the defense spending issue in Japan, the economy, so many things to talk about. So Tobias will make some brief remarks, and then we'll open this to the floor and to people online to ask questions. Tobias.
Sure. Thank you, Andy. It's fantastic being back here at the FCCJ for the first time at what for me is, I guess, your new the new building, but perhaps not new to people who are here all the time. But it's great to be here, Andy, and I'm looking forward to just having a conversation with you and
sure.
Hearing the questions from the viewers and from people here. I'm going to speak briefly, and then hopefully we can get right into questions and see where our conversation goes. But what I want to propose, and I did talk about this or hinted at this sort of in the later chapters of my book, but I think what we've really seen and has, I think, really become apparent under the Kishida administration is the extent to which the LDP and Japan are now governed by something you might call the Abe system, where power is functioning in a certain way. The policies that the government's pursuing are very much a blueprint and really a set of programs that were very much outlined during the Abe years. And frankly, that it seems like this is going to continue along these lines for at least a number of years to come. And so I'm going to just speak briefly about what that means. And I think I'll start with foreign policy, where I think it's really the most obvious, where we saw Abe articulate an approach to Japan's foreign policy that I think starts with one, doing whatever it takes to keep the U.S. Engaged in the region, which took a number of different forms. I mean, for Abe, that was taking on members of his own base to bring Japan into TPP. It was making changes to Japan's national security laws. During the Trump years, of course, it was forging or attempting to forge a close relationship with the U.S. president. So really, that sort of pattern certainly remains, I think, the most fundamental principle of Japan's foreign relations. And what that also means, though, and we are seeing this at the moment, that it is not just whereas during the Cold War it was Japan providing bases in exchange for security, that very clearly keeping the United States engaged in the region now also means Japan doing more to defend itself, to contribute to regional security, to be an economic partner of the United States, and all of that remains, I think, the core guiding principle. The other, I think, beyond working to keep the United States engaged in the region, of course, is the emphasis on ties with the maritime democracies, so India, Australia, really investing in building the Quad. And of course, we've seen that continue, particularly with Australia under Prime Minister Kishida. And then maybe the third principle is sort of looking at Southeast Asia as the place where Japan's foreign policy is playing out, and where there's where competition with China is playing out, and that means Japan setting the tone on infrastructure investment, on development assistance, on political support, capacity building. That Japan is going to be invested in the success of Southeast Asian countries, and the the independence, the continuing independence of Southeast Asian countries going forward. And again, we've, I think, seen a continuation of that approach under Suga, under Kishida. They've both made trips to the region, and clearly, and of course, there's an interest, I think, as we saw this week, an indication that there's plans to greatly expand Japan's ODA. I mean, clearly, that approach is continuing under Kishida as well. Looking to to economic policy, I think it's safe to say after a year or so of Kishida that we are very much still governed by the broad framework, or Japan is very much governed by the broad framework of Abenomics. That Kishida, despite talking about a new form of capitalism as his guiding economic policy framework, the substance of that has clearly been lacking, and we're seeing that Abenomics, the choices that Abe made, continue to dominate Japan's economic policy. I mean, the Bank of Japan continues to do as much as it's done for the last decade. And frankly, even with a leadership change in the Bank of Japan coming within the next several months, it is difficult to see a really sharp break with Kuroda's approach. On fiscal policy, the same sort of mix of stimulus in the near term with promises that eventually there'll be consolidation over the longer term. That remains the overriding approach. I mean, there's certainly, I think, one of maybe underappreciated as one of Abe's legacies is that the LDP went from a party that in 2009 happily ran on tax increases and was a party that believed in the need to for fiscal sustainability. The LDP has become a party much more comfortable with deficit spending. Excuse me, with deficit spending, and frankly, you look at, as we're seeing with the more right wing of the party, even I think flirtation or even a full embrace of something like modern monetary theory and this belief that deficits are not as constraining on Japan's policy choices as you might think. And of course, the late Mr. Abe was making that argument quite vociferously in the months before his assassination. So clearly that was, I think, a major change and something that continues to shape the LDP. And then what we might, I guess, if we talk about the third arrow, and of course it was always a question of what the third arrow of Abenomics actually meant, but if we look at it as a kind of state-led neo-development strategy, trying to find new sources of high value-added productive growth over the longer term, and basically trying whatever policy tool is available, and attempting to throw policies against the wall and see what sticks. Clearly, that approach still matters, and I think maybe the policy content of it changed, of course, under the Suga administration. You've got the emphasis on green transformation, digital transformation, and that's continued under the Kishida government. But the overall idea that the Japanese state needs to use its tools, whatever tools it has, to try to find these new growth opportunities remains, I think, the guiding philosophy as far as economic growth, long-term economic growth is concerned. Very much guiding the Kishida government. If anything, the Kishida government, and this maybe ties back into the second arrow, is much more comfortable using subsidies, using government spending and investment. This is not just using indirect tools like regulatory reform or tax incentives or things. It is much more comfortable with actually spending. So that just goes to show. I think that Abe's legacy really was to provide a blueprint that I think it has been very difficult for his successors to articulate a different approach. And as long as the world looks more or less the way it does now, as long as the U.S. is willing to be an active player in the region, as long as China is taking a more assertive, confrontational approach, we're likely to see these choices continue. One area in which maybe there's been a slight difference, and if we look at Kishida's rhetoric, maybe a difference in emphasis, where clearly I think there's this thread running through the Kishida government's policies, thinking about deglobalization and the reality that the global economy is not necessarily going to be governed by companies looking for the lowest costs as their paramount concern. That there's going to be other factors, and of course, the Kishida government is trying to use that as an opportunity to attract investment and to find other ways of high value added growth. And so that's maybe a slight wrinkle that's different, but that's just maybe taking the same philosophy of government and applying it to new circumstances rather than a fundamentally new change. I think if
Sure.
that's enough for us to start with, and we can.
There's plenty to talk about other than that, yeah. Okay. I have a bunch of questions here online. Also, obviously, from our guests in the room. You're more than welcome to ask questions.
Online question, I'm thinking.
Okay.
I have several.
Sure. Okay, I'll ask the first question. It's from Peter Elstrom at Bloomberg. He's saying that, Japan's preparing to boost its defense budget substantially and shift further away from the pacifist constitution it followed for more than 70 years. It's also aligning itself more closely with the United States and the West. What do you make of these changes? And what are the risks to the country and the region? And where do you see these military efforts going in the next 5 to 10 years?
So maybe start with the last one of those questions,
okay.
And work backwards. I think, this is really in some ways, these three documents are maybe the end of the beginning of a new phase in Japan's.
So could you explain the three documents?
Yes, okay, of course, yes, no, of course.
Yeah.
Yes, so we're going to get a new national security strategy, a new national defense strategy, and then a midterm defense program guideline. So how they're going to spend, or midterm defense program, how they're going to spend over the next I guess they're changing it to 10 years now, but historically it's been 5 years. So those documents, the cabinet is expected to approve them tomorrow. We'll have to see what actually ends up in the final versions, but I think what we do know is that there's going to be a substantial increase in defense spending included in them, something like 1.5 times more than the previous 5 years, looking something like 43 trillion yen. So a quite sizable increase, and that is a remarkable shift. I mean, during the Abe years, defense spending, he came into office wanting to reverse what at that point had been a decade of decline in defense spending, and budgets did rise every year when he was prime minister, but never really deviating from the long term. Not even so much of a constraint, but just sort of the long term expectation that defense spending would be around 1% of GDP, and clearly now there's a commitment to move beyond that. Whether it actually gets to 2% of GDP as has been suggested, if not promised by the prime minister, they're going to move beyond the level where Japan has been for quite a long time. But having made that decision now, there are substantial questions about how Japan will spend effectively, what that will actually mean. And I think one of the realizations, for even for defense experts and political hawks, that from growing out of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is that a lot of the spending that Japan needs to do is going to be not especially glamorous. It's not necessarily going to be buying expensive and fancy weapon systems. It's going to be, Japan's going to have to spend more on personnel. It's going to have to pay more to compete with private sector employers. It's going to have to improve facilities and make service in the self-defense forces more attractive. It's got to improve infrastructure. It's got to spend more on R&D. It's got to spend more on munitions and munition stockpiles. I mean, there's a lot of things that are going to have to be done. Beyond buying missile systems, of course. The other big change being acquiring capabilities to strike targets in neighboring countries in retaliation for attacks on Japan. So there's going to be purchases like that. We're going to see more warships and more planes, but a lot of the spending is going to be on things that are necessary to make Japan more effective and more capable and more resilient in the face of, in the event of a conflict, but things that are not necessarily, going to make for the flashiest recruitment ads or anything like that. So that I think that is really the thing to watch. As they figure out, okay, they're increasing their spending. How do they spend that in the most effective way? And I think that is going to be, a maybe in some ways a more complicated process. That the politics made this increase possible. I mean, and we can maybe talk separately about why that happened. But that it really is the start of a process now of figuring out, what are the most effective ways of spending that, not just what are the ways that, that result in the visible acquisitions. A lot of the changes are going to be less visible. In terms of the second question about the risks for the country and the region, in terms of the risk, I mean, I don't know if Japan increasing its defense spending is necessarily a source of risk, but it is certainly an acknowledgement that, I mean, there are risks. I mean, of course, the risk of direct conflict with China, whether inadvertent or not, over the disputed Senkakus in the East China Sea, of course, have risen over time as China has increased its presence around those islands. Naturally, the risks of a conflict between China and Taiwan have grown. Whether or not such a conflict is inevitable, I suspect that there's a risk in overstating the likelihood in the near future that could happen. Nevertheless, I mean, I think there's a recognition that the likelihood that Japan will be drawn into such a conflict is extremely high. I mean, just by virtue of hosting substantial U.S. forces that would likely be targeted in the early stages of such a war, in the event that such a conflict came. And so there does seem to be a recognition, certainly among Japanese decision makers, that this is a reality, that the strategic reality has changed, the military balance in the region has changed, and that Japan's existing defense efforts were perhaps not adequate for the challenges that the country faces. In terms of the first part of the question and aligning more closely with the United States and the West, I mean, clearly, of course, it's maybe less of a question of alignment and more about the nature of the relationship and how, and as I mentioned earlier, of course, that for Abe, it was keeping the United States engaged in the region, which meant Japan stepping up in a number of different ways. So it's not a question of alignment; it's a question of a division of labor and a recognition that Japan couldn't afford to be passive anymore. That the expectations, certainly, and if you look at recent strategic documents released by the Biden administration in the United States, I mean, the United States now expects that its partners in Asia are going to contribute more to regional security. That that there's concerns about the ability of the United States to do as much as it did in the past, and so an expectation that countries like Japan that are capable, that have the resources, will fill some of the gaps, as the military balance in the region has changed. So yeah, it's less about alignment and much more about just filling, allowing Japan to be less of a follower, less maybe sometimes of a free rider, and more of a kind of frontline leader in its own right.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Karen.
Hello, thanks to be here. My name is Karine Nishimura. I'm a correspondent for Libération newspapers as well as Radio France. I have two questions. First question, you mentioned the three documents, and in those three documents, the government is planning to include the expression of counter-strike capability. So for Japan, what does it mean, in your opinion? Second question, I'm French, I'm European, and I often talk with European analysts, and they have a quite different opinion on the defense budget increase. Some say Japan has some time to make the American happy. It means the budget on the paper will increase, but concretely what they will do, we don't know. And same thing for the counter-strike capability. So what do you answer to that?
Sure. I mean, clearly these are both things the United States government has wanted. Certainly more defense spending from Japan is something that the United States government has wanted for almost the entire existence of the bilateral alliance. I mean, this is not a new development by any means. The U.S. position on counterstrike has been more complicated because, of course, you have had a division of labor where the expectation was the U.S. would have the strike capabilities and Japan would be, U.S. would be the sword and or the spear and Japan would be the shield. And I think certainly there's been concerns in the past that Japanese strike capabilities would be redundant, that you would have, that thered be worries about a lack of coordination, that it wouldn't necessarily be additive to the security relationship. And so it's certainly going to be, and it's certainly more complicated than Japan just buying missiles and then we can say it has a strike capability. I mean, clearly this has, there's going to be questions about how it's integrated into the alliance structure. That's going to take time. Clearly, Japan's going to have to invest more in intelligence gathering. It's going to have to invest more in the command and control that enables it to actually identify and then reach targets. I mean, so this is not something that, okay, they're going to put this in the budget and then, tomorrow we say they have strike capability. I mean, this is clearly something that's going to be a long-term process that's going to require a lot of coordination within the alliance framework. And so it is not an overnight thing. It's the beginning of a process. It is not the end of a process. And, I would expect it's going to take a number of years before, Japan could truly say that it has an effective deterrent of its own. And so, and really, we shouldn't overstate, I think, the impact that Japan's strike capabilities will have on the general balance of forces with China. For example, I mean, Japan is still going to be reliant on U.S. capabilities. It is not going to replace those. I mean, I guess at some level, perhaps it's a hedge against U.S. If the U.S. Decided that it did not want to be as committed to the defense of allies in the region, but even then, maybe it's in that case maybe it's a down payment in the event that the U.S. were to abandon Japan. But I mean, the reality is it is not supplanting the United States, and it's going to take work for it to be a complement to United States capabilities. So I don't know. I don't think we should necessarily assume that this is about making the United States happy in particular, because I think it's gonna be a lot of work. It's really gonna be a lot of work to integrate this. As far as spending is concerned, I mean, I think clearly the United States wants all of its allies to spend more. We now have this 2% of GDP referent, from the NATO context that is now traveling to a U.S.-Japan context. I think it would be a mistake to be overly fixated on that, though. I mean, as we've seen during the run-up to this, I mean, one, it doesn't look like they're going to get to 2% of GDP unless, unless Japan's economy shrinks in the next few years and the denominator gets smaller. I mean, and I don't think anyone wants that to happen. And so and frankly, I mean, I don't know. So they're gonna put lots of things into the equation that maybe don't look so much like what people normally think of for defense spending. I mean, clearly, they've decided that anything called defense-related infrastructure is going to be included in there. So there's going to be maybe some creative accounting. But again, it's less about the number. And I think it would be good for Japan to be less focused on the number. Be good for the United States to not focus too much on the number. Be more focused on what does Japan need to spend money on to defend itself, and is it able to do that with the budgets it has? And that should be ultimately the fundamental determination, not an arbitrary goal that Japan is going to have to do creative accounting to get to. And so I think in the United States, I think there are some who are celebrating this, but clearly, again, this is the beginning of, I think, a really challenging period for Japan as they figure out what to do with this and figure out how to absorb this new spending. This is not something that no one should be popping champagne about this. I mean, this is really a challenging process that's going to take time.
Thank you. So I've got a couple of questions here from Jake Adelstein at the Daily Beast. I'll give you the easy one first.
Okay.
He's asking, are you going to rewrite your book, The Iconoclast, and what will you add?
Not going to rewrite it, but at some point in probably the next year or so, there'll be a revised paperback edition with, of course, about the assassination, and then also, about what I've talked about today, this notion that, there really is something of an Abe system that has outlasted him and will continue to shape the choices of his successors, which was already in the existing version of the book, but I think we have now a couple years, I think, confirming that has been the case. And so it's not going to be too much additional material, but there'll be some.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next one's again related to Abe. I'll slightly rephrase the question. How would you evaluate Abe's character, or reevaluate his character, after the revelations he was a power broker for the Unification Church? Why do you think Abe continued to broker contact with the church and the LDP even when he knew of the group's sordid reputation?
In some ways they're almost different aspects of one question. I think you have to start with inertia to begin with, and of course, it was known that his grandfather had forged a relationship with the Unification Church, that his father had maintained those ties, and so there's a certain amount of these were relationships that were handed from generation to generation. But of course, if they weren't profitable for Abe and for the LDP, those relationships, at some point they would have just faded away. And so clearly there was value, and I think all of that has been revealed, and the extent to which the LDP benefited from campaign volunteers, money, all of that I think was apparent. I mean, clearly fundamental to the relationship. But certainly when I was working on my book, and aware of Kishi's relationship, with Reverend Moon, and that this was of course part of Abe's the history and his political inheritance. It was unclear how to write about this, and in the end, I couldn't figure out where it fits in the story. But the reality is, to Jake's question, that Abe, as a politician, recognized that power stems from winning elections, and the LDP recognizes that power stems from winning elections. And the LDP, throughout its history, has been willing to make a number of deals that enabled it, that have enabled it to win elections and to hold power. And so in that way, it makes Abe it's less about Abe and Abe's character and is there something unique about Abe, and it's more about the LDP as an effective machine for winning elections. And of course, Abe matters because he comes from a political dynasty that brought these relationships to the LDP and cemented these relationships, secured the relationships. But that's the reality. It was useful for the LDP. It helped the LDP win. And if the price was looking the other way, at how the church exploited people, it seemed like that was a price that the party was willing to pay. Was it is it appropriate that the LDP is now paying a political cost for that? I think absolutely. And clearly it was an issue that was waiting, in some ways waiting to be exposed. It's a tragedy that it was exposed in the way that it was. But clearly this is part of how the LDP has governed, how it has pursued politics. Ultimately that winning is important, and the LDP has been, I think, not always fastidious about how it wins and the deals that it's willing to make in a number of different ways. Of course, the LDP has made a very durable coalition with Komeito. I don't think anyone anticipated it would last more than 20 years with a party that has very different principles, that has, of course, that members of the LDP have viewed in much the same way that many people now view the Unification Church, and the LDP was willing to set aside some of those qualms because it's been a useful partnership. That the LDP, and again, not in dissimilar ways, the LDP has gotten volunteers, has gotten votes, has gotten critical support in key constituencies from Komeito. And so, I mean, this is how the LDP is really has fundamentally shown itself to be willing to be quite flexible when it comes to winning elections and pursuing power, and that's just a reality.
Okay, thank you. Okay, got a couple of questions here from Walter Sim. He's at the Straits Times in Singapore. The first one is, there appears to be differences within the LDP over how to fund the hike to the defense budget, with people in the Abe camp like Takaichi having opposed Kishida's tax hikes. How do you read this difference, and how will this impact Kishida's leadership?
So, clearly, this how to pay for it question, it starts, I think, with what I think the right wing actually believes, and I think we saw this, Abe really staking out this position in the months before his assassination, arguing that Japan actually is not constrained by its deficits. Essentially, the Japanese right wing has either effectively or tangibly embraced modern monetary theory, and this belief that as long as you are paying debts in your own currency, you have much more room to run up deficits than textbooks would suggest. And it is interesting, that to the extent that you do have Japanese politicians explicitly talking about modern monetary theory, it is on the right wing of the LDP, and of course Abe, without maybe using the words, basically was arguing for that position before his death, and sort of recognizing that this belief essentially that raising defense spending and strengthening Japan's defense capabilities is too important to be to allow the Ministry of Finance to set the terms of it. And I think that's fundamentally where it comes from. The right wing, of course, is very powerful within the LDP. It is the essentially dominant ideology of the party's largest faction, and of course its reach extends beyond the Abe faction. There's of course something of a conservative bloc within the party that wields tremendous influence, and we saw it in the LDP election in which Kishida ended up winning. And so, this is clearly an issue that is a top priority for them. It is clearly something that they've been preparing for a while to make the case for, that Japan can increase defense spending and has room to pay for it with deficit spending. And meanwhile, to a certain extent, this is less even a conflict between Kishida and the LDP's right wing than a conflict between the right wing and the Ministry of Finance. And again, we go back a year ago during the general election campaign, when you had the administrative vice minister of finance very unusually write in a publication criticizing certain politicians for their irresponsible spending and for basically enabling Japan to become a debt Titanic that was headed for the iceberg. And of course, we saw Abe explicitly arguing against that. We saw, of course, Minister Takaichi arguing against that. And so, clearly, in some ways, the line of conflict is there between the Ministry of Finance and the right wing as much as it is between Kishida and the right wing. But of course, I think under the Kishida government, we have seen the Ministry of Finance is in a stronger position than perhaps it's been in a number of years. And so, to some extent, this conflict was, it's been ongoing, and this is just the latest battle in this longer conflict between conservatives who think that the goal of increasing defense spending and strengthening Japan's defense capability should trump everything, and the Ministry of Finance which believes that Japan's future really depends on fiscal sustainability and not running up deficit spending. And so fundamentally, this is a clash of ideas, a clash between two different centers of power that are pulling the Kishida government in different directions. And you have Kishida in the middle, who, of course, is in the uncomfortable position of, to some extent, being from a smaller faction in the LDP, needing to keep conservatives on side, and his victory to some extent depended on his ability to court them during the LDP leadership election. But of course, also being deferential to the Ministry of Finance, and trying to find a balance between the two. And it looks like, for the moment, the balance he's striking is we will raise taxes eventually, just not in the immediate term. And it's not clear that's going to be enough to make the right wing happy. And if we're going to see more pressure from the right wing on this issue, what could be interesting to watch is whether Kishida is able to use this to strengthen his position. I mean, of course, as this year comes to the end, his approval ratings have been fairly stagnant as a result of the scandals in his cabinet and the Unification Church scandal. But he, perhaps, if he's adept enough, has the opportunity, perhaps, to say, I want to be a responsible steward of the country's future. We do have to raise defense spending, but we also need to ensure that we're doing it sustainably and responsibly. And so that is why I'm willing to raise taxes. And if he continues to face pressure from the right wing on this, it's certainly possible that he could, maybe in a kind of judo move, use the right wing's kind of momentum and aggression on this issue to assert his leadership and try to discipline these unruly members of his party, and maybe even use it, not unlike leaders have done in the past, perhaps if circumstances change, to call a snap election. I don't think he's in those circumstances now, but if we're looking at a year of discord on this issue, it's certainly there are ways of imagining that he might be able to turn it to his advantage.
Which leads me to Walter's follow-up question, which is, do you think Kishida can survive 2023 as Prime Minister?
I suspect as things stand now, yes. I think he's heading into the new year. I think at some point the Unification Church issue is going to fade. Now the legislation has been passed. The kind of drip of new revelations seems to have slowed. So in that sense, I think we might see some stability in his approval ratings. I think we've already seen maybe a modest improvement in at least one poll. So perhaps he's found bottom on that front. The LDP, I think, has seen its numbers dip a little bit, but not necessarily catastrophically so. So they don't necessarily have an incentive to unseat him prematurely. I think, for the moment, it does seem that the party's incentives probably would be to avoid an open succession fight at this point in time. That Kishida is maybe not the best option, but certainly better than a number of the alternatives, or having an open fight between the right and other parts of the party over who should lead the party. And so certainly, I think he can survive through the G7 summit that he's going to lead later this year, and possibly coming out of that summit might find himself in a more stable, if not a stronger position. Of course, much is going to depend on what the economic outlook looks like. Do conditions start recovering? Do wage increases materialize in the spring? I think that could help his prospects as well. We certainly don't know what that's going to look like yet. But I think ultimately, Kishida in many ways at the moment looks not unlike Abe during the final years of his second administration, at least pre-COVID, where there were scandals. His approval ratings weren't in great shape. The public wasn't necessarily happy with him, but the party saw no real reason to replace him. And just simply from a continuity of leadership perspective, that given the challenges that Japan faces internationally, that there would be a disincentive within the party to invite that leadership vacuum. And so, I would guess at this point that Kishida is probably safe at least through the end of his term in 2024. I think it is an open question at this point whether he has, whether he'll be in a position to win another term and whether the party will continue to back him at that juncture. But I think I would say the odds are better than even at this point that he is able to last through the end of his term.
I guess he's determined to hold the G7 in Hiroshima as well?
Well, we will see that happen, and we'll see if he's able to use that forum as a way maybe to raise his international profile a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, any more from the floor? Yes?
I have two questions. One is about Hiroshima. What will be the reaction of the American government if Kishida push too much to produce a document about nuclear weapon? And maybe if you have an idea of France. I have mine. And other question about Abe legacy. Is it also an Abe legacy to decide by avoiding the discussion at the parliament? I mean, on the three documents, two parties decided by themselves without debate at the parliament. Is it also Abe legacy?
So to the second issue, I mean, no. I mean, these are documents. These are like, in the past, these have always been, these are government documents. They're not, they're not laws. So, I suspect when the Diet reopens in, for next year, and the Budget Committee, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. And, of course, I mean, anything connected to the budget is fair game, and so I'm sure there'll be the questioning about that in the new year. But as far as preparing these documents, I mean, these are internal government documents. I mean, they're not, in the past they haven't been the result of parliamentary deliberations, and so no, this is, I mean, I think this is not unlike the equivalent documents the United States produces. I mean, they're executive branch documents. They are produced by the Prime Minister's office and the Foreign Ministry, Finance Ministry, or I guess Finance Ministry has things to say about it, but Defense Ministry. I mean, this is these are executive branch documents, not something that the legislature has to sign off on. But yes, I expect the legislature will have things to say in the new year. To the first question, I mean, I think every Japanese prime minister is in an uncomfortable situation as far as nuclear weapons is concerned, right? And look, Abe, gestured, at points in the direction of moving towards a world without nuclear weapons, and as the country that was atomic bombed, in some ways that's something that the Japanese government is almost obligated to say. But of course, the reality at the same time of being defended by U.S. nuclear deterrence means that Japan can't exactly push too far in that direction. And Kishida, I think it will be even more awkward for Kishida being from Hiroshima, and having decided that this is going to be something that he absolutely wants to realize. But he is no less bound by the reality of Japan depending on U.S. extended deterrence and a U.S. nuclear umbrella, and I don't expect that he's going to find a way out of that paradox any more than any prime minister before him has found a way out of that paradox. And so, you can have all sorts of aspirational documents about eventually moving to a world without nuclear weapons, but in terms of tangible steps in that direction, I don't have high expectations, even from a prime minister who comes from Hiroshima.
Interesting as well that South Korea, there's a lot of talk in South Korea about them moving towards developing their own nuclear weapons, which would spice things up here.
It certainly, I mean, and of course, one of Abe's last contributions to public discourse was calling for a debate about U.S. sort of mutual deployment of nuclear weapons, U.S. nuclear weapons in Japan, and that of course has died down in the months after his assassination. But I think we might see that kind of discussion come roaring back in the event of if South Korea went that direction. I mean, so spice things up is maybe an understatement. I mean, I think it would certainly change thinking about at least having a discussion about what Japan needs. I think still unlikely that Japan would want an independent deterrent, and I think its first option would continue to be, relying on the U.S. But so the bigger, I think, impetus if Japan were to go in that direction would be a change in the U.S. posture rather than South Korea, but it would certainly shake things up here.
Sure. Okay, on the economy, so I think it was recently that South Korea surpassed Japan in terms of GDP per capita. And I read a report today, a projection by a think tank, an economic think tank here, that Japan's GDP per capita will fall behind Taiwan this year or next year. Well, next year, I think. So looking back, therefore, at Abe's legacy, his biggest possible legacy of Abenomics, do you think that was a success, and why? Or why not?
No, I think you can always, the debate about Abenomics always comes down to which numbers you want to point to, right? That I think, you look, of course, Abe's defenders like to point at the employment figures and the fact that, record numbers of jobs to applicants, that the ratio, reached record levels, and you did see the first pay increases in years, even if they weren't as high as had been desired. They like to point to the stock market, even though that was not, with the Bank of Japan in the market, perhaps that's not a true measure. But in terms of, I think, stepping back from the numbers, and I don't want to downplay the employment figures, even if some of those jobs were, if it was non-regular employment, clearly, young Japanese, I think, fared better than they had in a long time. The job market they were in was better than it had been in a long time, and I think as a result, the unusual data point of Abe and the LDP being especially popular among the young, I think is something that people are always surprised by. But I don't think you can dismiss the importance of the job market and seeing wages rise. But if we're looking at the big picture and what Abe had wanted to achieve with Abenomics, which was finding a new sustainable model of growth for the long term, I don't think he solved that. And of course, if you look at growth during the Abe years, on average, it was pretty anemic. You did not see, truly robust growth and the beginning of a new kind of productivity, high productivity led growth model. The virtuous cycle they talked about of rising wages, rising consumption and rising that didn't happen. And so you have maybe a lot of anecdotes about ways in which Japan is moving into high tech sectors and more competitive perhaps, but the reality is that you have an economic model in which incumbent firms still lock up too much productive capital, too much labor, and there weren't really enough changes that shifted people and shifted resources to newer firms in high growth sectors. And so that to the extent that they were trying to achieve that during the Abe years, I don't think it was a success.
Okay, and going forward for Kishida, what is his next big call? Will be the selection of the next Bank of Japan governor.
Yep.
Do you think he'll continue with a Kuroda-like figure, sticking to the ultra-easy policy, or do you think that at some point Kishida and the people around him may want to try to reel in the Bank of Japan a little?
I suspect that, unlike not that Kuroda was necessarily a doctrinaire, reflationist, mm-hmm. Compared to some of the other potential candidates that Abe could have picked 10 years ago. But clearly, in effect, that's what he was. And so I think whoever replaces him is not likely to be as sympathetic, maybe as drawn from that school of thought or as close to that school of thought. And I think, just institutionally, it'll be an interesting question whether you get someone more from the Bank of Japan. Of course, there was lots of debate about Kuroda being a Ministry of Finance official, in the earlier in his career, and so we'll have to see if there's someone who moves back coming from the BOJ, which also could mean a greater insistence on the bank's independence, which could mean a move to more normalization. I mean, I think you did get the accord between the Abe government and the Bank of Japan in practice meant the bank could maintain its de jure independence. You had, if we recall, 10 years ago, the threat from Abe and other LDP members was to, change the BOJ law to limit, the bank's independence. They got to, the bank preserved its formal independence, but in practice, of course, monetary policy did end up effectively subordinate to the government's economic policy priorities. And so it will be an interesting question to see whether you end up with someone who's going to defend the bank's de facto as well as its formal independence, and if there's a bit more of a push for normalization as a result of that. But in practice, given that the inflation that you see now could be transitory, that you could see a return to low inflation or outright deflation, it's also hard to see the BOJ exiting in the near term, and also given the government's fiscal situation, and that it would be very difficult to imagine Kishida being happy with a BOJ interest rate hike. I mean, of course this is a long-term question. At what point will the BOJ ever be able to exit? And much, of course, is going to depend on the overall global economic environment, what the Federal Reserve is doing. Perhaps we've seen the dollar-yen move to more sustainable levels now that will reduce some of the pressure that we saw earlier this year on the BOJ to maybe consider exiting its ultra-loose money. So I think, in the immediate term, it's hard to see a sharp break. But I think, this institutional question of do you get someone who's more committed to the BOJ's independence in all forms, and what that means down the road, I think is going to be a question to watch in this process.
Okay, got a question here from Fred Varco. He's a freelancer. Do you think that Abe's longevity as prime minister and his assassination have persuaded some people to gloss over some of his more right-wing views? I left out the word odious.
I think what we saw in the debate around the state funeral earlier this year was the extent to which there were at the very least two Abes. And there was the Abe that the Japanese people knew, who and I think saw him as a very polarizing figure, and I think to the very end, was someone who, whose conservative views were certainly not shared by, I think, the majority of the public. Who's he sort of the way he strong-armed the press was not necessarily popular. I think his determination to wield power and the ways in which he wielded power, the ways in which he, essentially one of his legacies was moving towards more majoritarian government. The idea that if you have the numbers in the Diet, you could do what you want with that majority. I mean, that is generally not how Japanese democracies work, where you've had much more consultation and respect for minority views. And the views of opposition parties were taken into consideration, for long stretches of LDP, even when the LDP dominance. Abe clearly moved away from that. Felt that if I have a majority, I should be able to govern how I want, and I think that did make him a more controversial figure. It did, I think, lead to some of the deep-seated, I think, animosity that you saw, I think, from a number of people, and sort of the protests that we saw at various points during his tenure were, I think, fueled by that. But I don't think you can also dismiss the extent to which he was appreciated overseas as a particularly, an especially visionary Japanese leader, who had a clear sense of, the challenges that faced Japan and the United States and other partners in the region. That Japan can and should play a greater role, both within Asia and globally, and really, articulated, a set of policies, followed through on them, and really carved out leadership roles for Japan in international settings in ways that I don't think really had ever happened before. Maybe most notably in international trade policy, where Japan went from being always having something of a defensive stance in international trade negotiations to actually leading them outright during his tenure. And so, clearly, I think there was an appreciation abroad for Abe as being something of a singular Japanese statesman. And so I don't think it's fair to minimize that. I mean, I think those were real accomplishments and a real legacy that we're continuing to see. But we also then shouldn't minimize, the real, I think, ambivalence at the very best that I think many Japanese had about him as a political leader and his approach to governance. That oftentimes his approach to politics was, well, if people don't agree with me, I just need to explain more to them, rather than, what perhaps the current prime minister would talk about, the importance of listening. That was not the kind of leader Abe was. That he had his vision, he was going to pursue that, and he was going to, do what he could to overcome resistance and obstacles, wherever possible. And that clearly did not necessarily make him a popular and well-loved leader at home.
Okay, I think that probably wraps things up quite nicely.
Right at the time.
Unless anyone on the floor has any more questions, we'll call it a day. Okay, thank you, Tobias.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. This was great.
Real pleasure, always a pleasure, and I'm sure we could talk a lot more. Okay, thank you all.